My task today will be very simple on one hand, and a crime it will be very grave. I'm not standing between you and your lunch. I'm standing between you and a fascinating conversation. So I'll try to be as short as I possibly can, and the task is very easy because I'm a little bit of a kind of a warm-up band while the real artists are coming on stage. And the real artists are, here's a story how this panel actually came together, which is absolutely true. When David reached out and said, can you speak about the fourth industrial revolution again? I said, it's mainstream now. You know, when we started talking about it 2 years ago in Davos and David brought it to his summits, it was really emerging. And it was a fascinating idea. We took a few concepts that already existed and we said that the speed of change and the convergence of cyber, physical, and biological worlds will lead to new business opportunities that were very hard to imagine a few years ago, as well as a few challenges and risks we really need to be cognizant of. David said, okay, but before I let you off the hook, do you know a foremost expert in AI, blockchain, all things technology and finance related, who is a fantastic speaker, works at the World Economic Forum, and happens to be Canadian? I said, yes, I do. I have a perfect guy for you. And with this, my great pleasure, I would like to introduce Jesse to you, who has a perfect partner in crime in Todd. And I really wish you a very fruitful conversation. Thank you.
As many of you know, Intralinks is a leading financial technology provider for the global banking, the deal-making community. I think if the numbers are correct, about 99.999% of Fortune 1,000
that
firms
does sound just about right.
Today.
Yeah, that's right.
Almost $35 trillion in transactions. And the deal flow indicator is a product that I've certainly come to appreciate and benefit greatly from, and it helps us in the assembly of these forums to be looking forward. It's always great to talk about what's happened, particularly if it was good for you. It's interesting to celebrate in the moment what's happening now, but most importantly, and I think the individuals that are gathered here today are to talk about what's coming. So I appreciate, Todd, the expertise that you bring. Jesse is Canadian, but that's purely accidental. Daniel completely made that up. But we're very proud of you. Jesse has authored some of the most important papers and guided some of the most important bodies on the future of finance on this planet. And his relationship with financial executives, with regulators, with fintech innovators on all subjects that are guiding, directing, and influencing how finance is going to be conducted is something that we all have the benefit of experiencing here today. So without any more, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Let me get out of the way and let you get started.
Thanks very much. And I also want to thank Evan and Nigel as well. When M&A asked me to come down here, I didn't know that I'd be surrounded by so many Canadians. My better half is Canadian, and so along with all of the knowledge about food, you guys have also given me a lot of table conversation for Canada Day in a couple of weeks when I'm the only American at the table, so that'll be great. But I think I wanted to start off, Jesse, as we talk about some of the technologies that we're talking with customers about every day in the areas around blockchain, around artificial intelligence, and really just get your thoughts and ideas on what the implications are for people in this room and what they should expect as these technologies come into their daily workflows.
Well, thanks so much, David, and Todd. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been put up on a bit of a pedestal, and hopefully I'll be able to deliver. And at least I can start by saying good news, because I think for folks in the capital markets space, we've seen that the fintech revolution, as it's sometimes called, has been much more about the change in the competitive dynamics than it has been in the competitive landscape. We've seen very much a world in which a lot of new and exciting toys have been given to folks in the capital market space that can help them to be more efficient and more accurate, but we haven't necessarily seen the incumbent players be upended in the way that was sometimes predicted in the early days. And so I think what we're seeing that's really exciting is opportunities to increase the efficiency of deal-making processes, opportunities to automate research. I think some really interesting deployments of AI in that space. We saw recently the acquisition of Kensho, a Boston-based AI company that really is all about automating scenario-based analytics. Saw it acquired by S&P. Expect to see some significant scaling there. And then we're also seeing a lot of things like Dealflow that are really helping people to understand how to take their existing human sales forces and deploy them more accurately, helping them know what to bring to their customers and what the right time to bring it is.
That's really interesting, and you mentioned the DFP in the introduction there, but that's an area where, as we've talked with customers, that customers turn to us and say, well, that's great, Intralinks, you've got some marketing information that you put out there that can really talk about and predict accurately some of what the deal count's going to be, but what we've really recognized over the last 12 to 18 months is a lot of interactions with our customers who are looking for us to expand that analytics as well. And so, as you mentioned, one of the areas that we're certainly talking with customers about and implementing for them is being able to do some buy-side analytics, as people are looking to be able to start all the way at the beginning and start to look for some buyer matching algorithms. They're also beginning to look and say, how can I speed up the due diligence process by, automating some of that diligence right up front and having the technology look for key risk items. Jesse, you mentioned fintechs and how they were supposed to, eat everybody's lunch. And at the risk of, asking that question about are they still a threat, recognizing that, at Intralinks we think of ourselves as one of the original fintechs. Curious what your thoughts are there.
So, I mean, I started this initiative at the World Economic Forum back in 2013. And back then, if you went to the Bay Area or to a lesser degree places like Singapore and Shoreditch, you'd hear this story about how, a couple of guys or gals in a garage were going to upend financial services. They'd sort of, cast down JP Morgan and emerge as the new titans of financial services. And I think that, that's why today we live in a world in which the majority of payments are done by mobile phone, and in which the sort of ultimate brands of financial services are once little-known technology companies. Or at least that's how the story played out if you live in China. If you live in North America or Europe, we really live in a world in which the competitive dynamics have changed, but the competitive landscape hasn't. We found that fintechs faced an enormous challenge in terms of acquiring scale. We saw that they faced very high cost of customer acquisition, high switching costs. And I think perhaps most importantly, those more agile financial institutions were really able to treat these venture-funded fintechs as an external R&D provider, really seeing what capabilities in terms of either back office or experience management that were working and either acquire or mimic them. Great example of that, I think, has been in the robo-advisory space, right? Robo-advisory is a brilliant concept to bring asset management to mass affluent and mass market individuals. But ultimately, the people who have been most successful in driving it to scale have been Vanguard, who now have $75 billion or $80 billion in AUM, as opposed to Betterment, who really kind of germinated the idea of the robo-advisor, who's only got about $12 billion in AUM.
Very, very interesting. We, if I shift the conversation there a little bit and ask you about some of the big technology companies, I know in my time working with some of the larger banks that there was a time not that long ago where it was unheard of when I would talk to an institution about them using a cloud service like Intralinks, much less moving any of their other mission critical or business critical systems to AWS or to the Microsoft cloud. What's your experience so far in that realm?
I mean, I remember when I first started out on this project, I think it was in 2014, I sat down with the CEO of a Fortune 100 financial institution and asked him about cloud. And he said, never in a million years will we go off-prem. It turned out it took about 3 years, right? Cloud is now central to the vast majority of financial institutions' strategy for how they're going to escape the limitations of the legacy core. We're seeing people deploy modular architecture, and in that re-architecting process, we're seeing them acquire both cost savings, but increasing flexibility and interoperability. And so that's why when people ask me the question, are the big techs going to enter financial services? I say that's the wrong question. They're already here. We're relying on services like AWS and Microsoft Azure in order to deploy the flexible architecture that we need. But even more importantly, increasingly, we're relying on large technology companies as endpoints for interactions with our retail customers. Think, for example, about Amazon Alexa. We've had dozens and dozens of financial institutions now deploy skill packs so that their customers can talk to Alexa about their bank balances or their brokerage position. For me, the question isn't whether or not the big techs are going to enter financial services. Rather, it's about how financial services will be re-architected. Will large technology companies be able to seize the experience layer of financial services, consolidating it for retail customers and for SMEs, building out advisory value propositions on the back of that data, and capturing the lion's share of the rents in the industry?
Very good, very good. You mentioned AWS there, and I read a sarcastic tweet on the way down here this morning that was talking about Jeff Bezos announcing to the world that anyone who is concerned about data privacy and Alexa, that you can now go through a system to rappel into the Amazon data centers and deploy your own viruses, and Alexa will forget everything that she's ever heard you say in your office or in your home. But one of the things that I've certainly experienced talking to the banks about their hesitancy in the past about moving to the cloud and things like Alexa and data privacy is about regulators. And I'm curious, as you've talked with customers about different technologies being deployed across these processes, how do the regulators play into it from your perspective?
So, I think that's been a really interesting story. Back in 2013, we convened 50 or 60 C-suite executives in Davos to kick off this project. And I asked them what they were worried about in the fintech space, and they said, Jesse, we're not worried about any of this nonsense. They knew that they had some trust, though this was after the financial crisis, so they weren't very confident about it. They knew that they had scale, and they were somewhat confident in that, but they'd seen other players fall to scale. The thing that they were really confident about was that they had regulators and regulatory complexity on their side, that the regulators would never allow new entrants to disrupt the industry. I tell you, I've never heard a group of financial executives speak so glowingly of their regulators. I think that 3 and 4 years later, we've seen that completely flip end over end. Regulators, particularly consumer protection and securities regulators, have been very aggressive, not just about allowing fintech, but embracing it. You look at the FCA, and they've practically deployed a competitive strategy around attracting fintechs to London. The MAS in Singapore has been explicit about their desire as a regulator to found a fintech technology cluster. And so I think that the consumer and the securities regulators haven't been the impediment that a lot of large financial institutions thought they would be. At the same time, I think there's a new regulator on the block that people haven't quite woken up to the importance of. Financial services is increasingly, in my view, shifting from being a scale capital game to a scale data game, particularly where customer experience is concerned. And in that space, we're seeing the data regulator, a cross-industry regulator, really emerging as the most important definer of what you can and can't do in that space. If we think about the Second Payment Services Directive in Europe, if we think about GDPR, these are fundamentally cross-sector data regulations, but they absolutely impact what you're going to be able to do in terms of deploying sophisticated new algorithms. And so they have not just a compliance set of ramifications, but a competitive set of ramifications. And as we in the US start to move into those types of discussions, I think it'll be really important for financial institutions to think about the implications for their competitive positioning.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the competitive angle of regulations like GDPR. I'm curious to hear more from you on that. It's certainly an area, GDPR being the poster child of, or the regulation du jour that everyone is talking about. And as we have engaged with customers in the deal lifecycle aspects of, how does GDPR play into due diligence of actually getting a deal closed? A lot of those conversations have centered around being able to close those deals faster. And specifically, I'm talking with private equity companies who are actually mandating that their portcos are actually getting material information together and that be able to address GDPR questions during the diligence process helps. It even helps all the way down to valuations because a potential buyer isn't having to look at that as additional risk and extra work that's going to have to be done post-close. How's GDPR been in the world economic conversations you're doing?
I mean, I think it's just been really important. And for me, when I look at financial services today, I think that we're seeing a regionalization of operating models, with GDPR and PSD2 as being two examples of that. Those data regulations are shaping a very particular mechanism for the operation of financial services in Europe, and it's totally different than the one that we see in China. I mean, Europe, I think, is the furthest forward in terms of customer-centric privacy. By contrast, I had a conversation in China, and I asked a fintech entrepreneur, are any of your, this is a really interesting offering, but any of your customers worried about the privacy implications? And he said to me, you Westerners, you're obsessed with privacy. Privacy's been dead for 15 years, and you guys just haven't woken up to it yet. And so I think we're going to see competing models at the regulatory level. I think it still remains to be seen how the United States is going to develop its views on data protection, in particular data portability. But those are going to fuel fundamentally different environments for financial services. If data isn't portable, you'll inherently see the financial institution today remain at the center. They'll be able to deploy a walled garden of providers around them. I suspect that in Europe, where data has become portable under open banking in the UK and PSD2 in Europe, that you're actually increasingly going to see a separation between the experience layer and the balance sheet and the product manufacturing layer, with really deep implications for competitive dynamics.
Really interesting, really interesting. So I saw a sign somewhere. We've got a few minutes left, and we've almost made it to the end of this session, and you actually haven't uttered the word blockchain yet. And I haven't been at a conference or seminar in the last 2 years, I don't think, where blockchain hasn't come up. An area where I find myself most commonly in our segment talking about blockchain in the deal process is around using the blockchain technology from a point of view of being able to get into the audit trails of what's actually going on during the deal process and who's had access and all of the transparency that goes along with that. And potentially, again, being able to speed up deal closing. If you use blockchain technology potentially to get to the point where the entire audit of deal execution is in the chain, can we actually connect the dots to regulators at some point so that they can speed up the closing of deals there as well? What are your thoughts on this mystifying technology?
So I mean, I think the discussion around blockchain can be prone to a lot of sort of perhaps over-enthusiasm. I remember in 2014, I was at a conference and somebody sort of put their hand up and said, well, given that Bitcoin will have replaced the US dollar as the international reserve currency by 2017, isn't it the case that, and as I think we know, the value's gone up a lot, but certainly not dethroned the dollar yet. The way that I think about blockchain is in two parallel conversations. But firstly, I think that the important way to think about this technology isn't for the vast majority of us to dive into the details of how it works, to figure out the difference between proof of stake and proof of work or round-robin Byzantine sort of consensus protocols, right? Fundamentally, any offering that you're hearing about in blockchain is about a form of distributed, mutualized infrastructure. There are two main themes moving forward in that space. Theme one is the replacement of existing infrastructure with blockchain-based technology. And so there we've seen some interesting endeavors in the ASX, the Australia Stock Exchange, replacing their legacy cash equities settlement system, and the DTCC down the street looking to replace aspects of their trade information repository. Now, in the vast majority of these cases, it's not a pure play blockchain solution. Instead, it's a mix of centralized and decentralized technology. And I think the really important thing as participants from a business perspective in the industry isn't the underlying technology that's being used, just like you don't particularly care what brand of server your email is running on. Rather, it's about the new capabilities that are being offered. So in the case of the ASX, thinking about what this is going to do to settlement times, thinking about what it's going to do to the governance protocols overlaid, thinking what it's going to do to transparency and auditability, these are really important implications, but they're not about the blockchain so much as they are about the new capabilities. On the other side, you've seen this explosion of what I call the cryptoverse. And it's curious because I think over the last few years, we've had a shift from what we always heard of, oh, it's all about blockchain, not Bitcoin, to people suddenly doing more of, well, I want Bitcoin, right, not blockchain. And what I mean by that is that a lot of us in this room maybe thought to ourselves, maybe a year ago, maybe I should own some of these crypto assets. And maybe you called your broker and said, get me into some Bitcoin and some Ether. But the reality is that your broker can't do that. And so there's a demand today for a greater interlinkage between the traditional financial system and these emerging crypto assets, people wanting to take small denomination, speculative positions in them. And I think what we're going to see more and more discussion about is what are operational best practices for that interconnection between traditional and non-traditional capital markets, and most importantly, what are the risk protocols and the governance systems that need to be put in place on top of that to ensure consumer protection and to mitigate systemic risk.
That's really great feedback and great insight on that. I know I was recently asked by my oldest son to up his allowance to get a new rig to start mining Bitcoin himself. That's his college plan. So I think our time was too short. It was really a great conversation. I look forward to continuing it here with yourself and with other people, and look forward to the next session. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much. All right. Thank you.
Jesse, if you'll stay, I think we can probably squeeze in one question.
All right.
Yes, please.
Henry An with HHN Capital. So the world of financial services and the world of technology is converging. The lines is becoming blurrier, whether it's a financial services company or a technological company. About a month and a half ago, I went to a private chat that the person who lost the horse race at Goldman Sachs, no shame to that person, he mentioned that he thought Goldman Sachs in 5 to 10 years will be more like a technology company than a financial services company. With that said, no surprise that the technological skill set, being able to code and be technological savvy, is extremely important. How about the art of human beings in terms of a handshake, relationship? How is that going to be valued going forward? Can you share your thoughts? Is that going to be just as important or less important? What are your thoughts on that? Thank you very much.
Sure. I can speak to this a little bit, and then Todd, I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on this as well. So I think firstly to this blurring of lines between financial institutions and non-financial institutions, I think we've traditionally thought of financial operations in product-centric verticals, and we've thought about those as heavily integrated value chains. I think what we're seeing right now is a flip of sorts, in which we're cutting horizontally, where there are impetuses from a data perspective and an efficiency perspective to consolidate the experience and interaction layer, aspects of the operation layer, to build out new enabling infrastructure. And so I think that it's critical to think about consolidation at the activity level as opposed to thinking about things in the traditional operating model boxes that we've seen in the past. And that's something that I think Goldman Sachs has been really out and ahead of with their principal strategic investment group, making investments along those lines. But your real question is, where is the role of the human in all of this? And I think that what we're going to see over the next few years is a complete shift. We've thought previously about where do we have to put humans. We've had humans in the back and in the middle office, and we've looked increasingly at ways to cut down the number of individuals in those areas. I think that we are going to run out of road on those headcount reduction strategies, that we will increasingly have high-level efficiency and best practices in the back and middle office become a table stakes, a commoditized capability that can be accessed as a software as a service basis. And so what we're going to do is we're going to see this flip over, and we're going to be thinking about where do we put individuals into the organization to increase value. And so I think it's about exactly the type of things that you've been talking about. It's about synthesized insight at the risk level, for example. It's about deepening customer relationships at the customer level. And so I think we're going to see a lot of the same roles continue to exist, but we're going to have those individuals move up the value chain and be more centered around the things that human beings are uniquely good at.
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, our CEO was just relating to me a story he had with someone at Goldman just last quarter, actually, and it was a very similar conversation that if they look in the investment bank today and they say, well, we've got really high value people at the top of a pyramid, and as you go down and that pyramid gets wider, and the analysts and associates that you have at the bottom, it's there if they can, the MD from Goldman was talking about flipping that pyramid and being able to create greater value positions at the top and have the pyramid be inverted with technology taking care of some of the analytics and that type of stuff at the bottom.
Tremendous. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.